Hello and welcome. This is the first of 3 webinar discussions supported by OVHCloud Startup Programme, and we're hoping to bring you some fresh angles and insights for when you're analysing cloud services and making cloud choices, whether you're at the beginning of your startup journey, planning for, or right in the middle of scale-up growth. So I'm Shân Millie, the accidental techie and enthusiastic activist for impact innovation. Try saying that in a hurry. I'll be your facilitator for this conversation, which is focusing on sustainability and cloud. And today we have 4 expert panelists to help us make sense of the new information, fresh choices and potential priorities for you, your founding teams and your advisors. So Chris Frogner is co-founder, CFO and leads on technology for ethical insurance startup Arma. Give us a wave, Chris. Thanks. Clara Wat, who's a VC expert specializing in climate tech at WeVenture. Morning, Clara. Sammy Fry, who leads on net zero for Tech Nation, including their highly successful net zero growth programs, and is also co-creator of Tech Zero, which we'll learn a bit more about later in the conversation. Give us a wave, Sammy. And finally, Swellen Arnauld, who's an expert in sustainability, renewables and shared value. And Swellen joined OVH as their sustainability program director just a couple of months ago in November of last year. Hi. So good to be with you this morning, experts. I'm very keen to put our fairly limited time this morning to good use. So let's kick off then by looking at the place of sustainability generally and carbon impacts specifically in that enormous list of jobs to be done that are facing the early stage firms and their advisors who are listening in on demand or meeting with us here this morning live. So Chris, your scaling firm, Arma, is B Corp certified. So you and your co-founders have put a leadership position in carbon impacts at the heart of your growth strategy. Chris, why? Why have you done that? Why do you see the benefit in that?
Thank you very much, Shân. Great to be here. So why have we done that? Well, for us, we as founders really personally care about ESG as a whole, so environmental, social, and governance, and obviously sustainability forms a huge part of that. You mentioned the fact that we are B Corp certified. So for those who don't know, B Corp is a certification you can get as a company. It's basically like fair trade for business. So what it does is it holds you to account on a number of verticals. They're all sort of ESG focused. They range from corporate governance through to workers, social, environment, obviously your customers, etc. So in terms of why, I think when we founded Arma, we set out to sort of make sure that when we make decisions internally, we consider how those decisions impact all our stakeholders, not just our shareholders, right? And obviously a huge part of that is sustainability and obviously carbon impacts of our business operations. Now we're a service. We provide a service. We don't deal in a physical product, but there still is quite a carbon impact of that. So one of the things we do, for example, is we use ecology to offset the carbon emissions directly related to employee travel, that kind of thing. We are part of the B Corp Climate Collective, aiming towards net zero by 2030. Now, one thing that I do get asked quite often is sort of how does the cost on this work? This must be quite expensive for you as a business, but actually, really, it's not. There's a very clear business case for doing this as well. It's the right thing to do for ourselves because we personally care about it and our staff do. It's the right thing to do for our customers. It resonates really well with them that we're focusing on the environment and on ESG. So it really is a key advantage there. And it's also just in general good for business. It means we get to work with like-minded organizations and try to make the world a better place. So for us, it's a win-win.
So you're talking there about purpose, Chris, and that's your personal purpose for you and your co-founder, which obviously really matters. You talked about your staff. Do you think as I say, taking that leadership position on carbon impact specifically, but also sustainability in general. Do you think that's helped you attract the staff that you want?
Absolutely, it helps us attract staff who really, you know, who care about giving back, who care about being sustainable, and that's what we're trying to build. You know, it's a core value of the business, so those are the kind of staff we want, and we absolutely see that. And you know that we know, for example, hiring's been an issue across a number of industries for the last, you know, sort of 12 months. It's very worker-led or candidate-led market. We've not seen that for ourselves. We've had no issue hiring whatsoever. So I'd like to think that our policies in respect of ESG and sustainability absolutely help us attract the right talent.
Okay, and I'd just like to dig in a little bit more into the cost aspect, because I mean, yeah, I mean, you would think clearly, show me, Chris, that it's not going to cost me any more than doing things without that kind of either the B Corp certification, which I know, because we've spoken about it before, was a very arduous process. You wouldn't necessarily think that everybody's going to go through that, but the cost stuff. So give us some examples about where those, perhaps those understandable ideas it's actually going to cost us a lot more, just don't prove not to be true.
Well, firstly, I think a lot of it starts with your internal policies around, you know, how you use electricity and energy, you know, by having, for example, a bike to work scheme, which, you know, we haven't actually set up, but we want to set up, by allowing staff to work from home to thus decrease, you know, fuel costs or whatever, like, you know, that actually helps dramatically. And also obviously having quite ardent and stringent recycling programs internally, we have that as well. But then it's also that you know, we made a decision to be based in a building which is close to being, you know, carbon neutral, and then actually offsetting the carbon emissions of your employees costs a lot less than you think. Obviously, it's very important that you go with the right provider. You don't want to be going with the provider who chops down a forest to only then replant the trees and pretends like that's a good thing, you know. But offsetting employee emissions, really, it doesn't cost you much as a business. It's something everyone can afford to do.
Okay, and just one last question on that then, Chris. You're a tech-enabled business in financial services. So even getting that kind of that measurement, that valued measurement of, well, where do we stand, in order to be able to offset ecology, have to tell you, well, this is what you need to buy in trees to offset your operations, right? So did that take very long, Chris? I mean, did you have, and did that cost a lot of money?
Not really. It will depend on your business operations, the scope of them, how many partners you have, and how many layers, etc. And that does complicate things a little bit. It can do, absolutely. We are, you know, candidly working on our scope 3 emissions internally and still trying to improve that, you know, by making sure we're using the right suppliers, all that stuff. And yet that is something that is a bit more tricky, that scope 3 side of things. Which is obviously measuring, you know, your wider network, not just your direct emissions, but also your indirect ones. But absolutely, providers, you know, offset providers will absolutely help you figure out what your actual impacts are.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. So Clara, coming to you then on this question of, you know, what's in it for the early stage firms, right? Why sustainability generally and carbon impacts specifically? You and B Ventures obviously focus very specifically on the climate tech sector, right? So I'd love to know what you see as the size of the investor opportunity here. How are you looking at the market as a VC and as B Venture? But then looking beyond that climate tech sector, what do you think is in it? What have startups and scale-ups across all sectors got to gain from taking this kind of approach, Clara? What do you think?
No, definitely. I think nowadays the climate tech opportunity can no longer be ignored, as in actually the climate tech venture investment is now 40 times larger than it was a decade ago. So it definitely grew intensively. And as of 2021, the size of the climate tech industry in Europe was estimated to be around 26 billion by the European Investment Bank. And despite the current crisis, 2022 was actually a great year for the climate tech industry. There was an increase in investment by 89%. And you've seen in the climate tech landscape a very large round as Northvolt in Europe, who raised a 1.1 billion growth round. So funny enough, the climate tech industry is doing very well in a time of crisis compared to the rest of the tech industry. So just for that, on an investor point, I would say it's not easy to ignore. I have actually been seeing a lot of venture capital funds that are sector agnostic, looking more and more into climate tech, wanted more opportunity there and to join the round. So that's also very great.
I was going to ask you about that actually, Clara, that, you know, you're obviously specialists in climate tech, but is it contagious? Is it spreading? Where there's money, the VC herd turns and follows, right? So what could, without necessarily naming names unless you want to, what other sectors are people particularly looking at in your VC community, do you think?
Oh, I think that it's definitely contagious, and it would be hard not to name one who is not going into the climate tech industry, actually. You're seeing big names as Accel and Sequoia looking into more and more the sector. And also, I would like to argue that sometimes climate tech is a bit all over the industries, as in now you're finding a lot more impact-driven topics within it. And for example, maybe the one topic that's getting the most attention right now is energy, because actually my fund was funded by Matthias Willenbacher, who created Juvi in Germany and one of the first wind turbines company. And so we have a really strong focus in energy. And right now we're seeing so many funds and also so many new startups entering the energy industry, because given the current crisis in Europe, it's important to find any energy efficiency solution. And I would say they are the startups that are benefiting from the best valuation I've seen around at the moment.
Wow.
So that would be maybe two key points of influence there.
Yeah, fantastic. So, okay, the future's bright if you're a climate tech, founding or scaling. So that question again around other sectors and why you think there's a really strong business case there. For them to be looking to be prioritizing all aspects of sustainability, but particularly carbon impacts a lot sooner maybe than they thought. Maybe they think it's something that that's nice to have and we'll deal with that when we're in maybe series B or C or even D. Why would you say that's not necessarily the most sensible approach?
Yes, I would say that nowadays impact reporting in general is coming sooner than later than we would expect it, especially in Europe with the new CSRD, so Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive from the European Union. Actually, now SMEs have to report on the different ESG metrics, including carbon, which is not the easiest to measure. And so I would agree that at the early stage, you definitely need to be ready for it. Because you will be asked as well from investors, because startups are not the only one being regulated early on. Also now investors, due to the SFRD, we now need to report on a yearly basis on the impact of our startups, and that includes carbon metrics. And I would say,
sorry, Clara, that goes
yes.
from when does that come into force? So what will you be reporting on this year? For instance,
Yes,
is it just this year that it's come into force?
so it's all very new, I would say, for both aspects, so startups and investors. So, for example, the CSRD comes into force this year, and same thing on the investor level, depending on which article you are at. Quite a complex process, but I would say that most investors are going to report in June on their impact report. And yes, that would be the first requirement for the impact VCs at least, or the ones that claim to use ESG metrics or to make it as a part of their investment strategy. But I think that sooner than we expect, that's going to be a requirement for all VCs and obviously all startups already. The second that they raised, I would say that they raised their Series A. Series B, when you're considered an SMEs, then you have to report on. And it's all a very new space that we're trying to understand. It's as hard on the investor level as on the startup level, but that's also why it's good that we're learning together. And also, I think at the moment we're preparing our early stage startups to be ready to answer those requirements, but also to benefit from it. Because, for example, for the next rounds, we're seeing more and more impact investors who have a sort of threshold of the impact potential that the startup has, and that, of course, on the carbon level would be a key point.
Wow. So all investors are going to need to take notice and be ready, not just the impact investors. The firm itself, anybody wanting to operate in the EU market, right? And that includes, hands up, I didn't vote for Brexit, but that includes everybody that doesn't think they're part of the, well, that we're not subject to the EU anymore, but wants to do business there. And then really interestingly, and perhaps we can talk about this a bit later on, the thresholds, how those thresholds are being defined and articulated as well. Fascinating, Clara. Thank you so much. All right, so hopefully people are sitting there thinking, okay, I'm a founder, I'm part of a founding team, or I'm an advisor or an investor. I'm convinced I want to get on with sustainability generally and carbon impact specifically. So Sammy, with your experience at Tech Nation today, running those very successful net zero growth programs for Tech Nation, and also as co-creator of Tech Zero, which perhaps you can unpack a little bit for us, explain that as well. What are your top tips for those ready to understand? Maybe they understand and now they want to measure. Maybe they've measured and they now want to take action. And or at the other end of the spectrum, actually take a leadership position on carbon emissions and impacts as part of their core business model. What are your top tips?
Hi, Shannon. Great to be here as well. It's a great question. And also I applaud anyone on the call who is an early stage founder who's already looking into this as well, because I know as a founder or as part of an early stage startup, it's probably the least of your priorities in terms of, emissions when you're looking to just scale a business in the first place. But there are so many practical steps that you can do to start off with. And I think many people often get caught up in the measurement side of things straight away. When I think, when you're really laying the foundations of your business, I think there's so many things that you can implement from the get-go to make sure that sustainability is core to your business essentially. So beyond measuring your emissions, I think to start with, actually Chris touched on a few of these. So there's your office space, for example. So as an early stage company, you might not have office space, but if you do, it's likely that you have a shared office space. So really making sure that your office, for example, is net zero aligned, which basically means that, ideally, if you're looking at, let's say, a WeWork, or there's forest space, or there's lots of other shared office space options, ideally that office space should have on-site solar, or at least be procuring renewable energy. It should have great, reuse and waste management practices, great practices on even like water usage as well, and high efficiency rates there. So there's that side of things. And at Tech Nation, we actually made the decision to move from our previous office space, which was actually WeWork, to another office space called Fora, because they've got a net zero strategy by 2030. And also from a cost angle as well, it didn't really incur any additional costs. It was very much cost competitive. Business travel is another kind of obvious one as well. So looking at train first travel, overflying. So if you're looking at any business trips to Europe, for example, or across the UK, it's just to make sure it's train first. Unfortunately, there is a slight, cost increase there at the moment, with train travel being slightly more expensive, at least in Europe, than flying. But hopefully that does reduce over the time. But I think that's really taking a leadership position. And then obviously, if you can avoid traveling, that's great. But it's also understandable if you need to. So I think train first travel where possible is kind of a mandatory requirement that should be in place. Then on the supplier engagement side, so it's likely if you're a startup SME, usually around 95% of your emissions will come from scope 3. So having a really great relationship with all of your suppliers is really important. So part of what we've done at Tech Nation, and I can touch a bit more about Tech Zero as well soon, is we're starting to reach out to all of our suppliers, and we're asking them, well, first of all, what progress have they made, if any, towards net zero? And we're just really encouraging them and supporting them to basically just get going and measuring their emissions. And down the line, we'll be requiring that all suppliers measure their emissions within a year of joining, within the next year of us kind of reaching out. And then within 2 years, we're asking them to set a formal net zero target as well. So we've got a template as well on Tech Zero, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later, which can definitely help. And then there's green pensions as well, which is often a really kind of an under talked about area. So on average, every individual emits about 23 tons of CO2 purely through their pension provider, because pensions have just such a historic association with fossil fuels. And now there's a few pension providers which are kind of very much net zero aligned. And actually they're growing at kind of exponential rates as well, which also goes to show it does, pay off to align with sustainability. So there's one company called Cushion. They launched a net zero aligned pension, I think, about 18 months ago. And I think yesterday they were just acquired by NatWest. So, I mean, hopefully that net zero aligned pension does carry on. But again, it's just a great sign that, basically aligning with sustainability really does pay off. And then other aspects to look at is, going plant-based first. So another initiative that we put forward is at all of our events, because Take Nation does a lot of events, that they're all basically plant-based. Obviously, that can be quite a firm stand for some companies. So even just making a start and having a meatless Monday, or just an initiative to incentivize employees to just reduce their meat consumption is a big one. Then hardware as well is another big focus area. So looking at refurbished laptops, if you are purchasing any kind of IT equipment, making sure that IT equipment can last approximately 4 years at least, and ideally that you're partnering with a provider who can repair any issues as well with your IT equipment to make sure that you don't have to just replace it. And then of course digital emissions, and this is a big one. So I mean the tech sector in general accounts for 4% of global emissions, 2 times the amount of aviation, and part of that is obviously data centers, but another part is tech companies, and large or small, as we've all highlighted, you can all play a big role. But I mean, in terms of digital emissions, I mean, the one thing to do is obviously aligning your cloud provider. So looking at a cloud provider that is aligned to renewable energy, that has ideally some on-site renewable energy on their data centers, and is looking at kind of like using energy to also advance cooling at data centers and that sort of thing, and then also just minimizing your files where you can, and also kind of clearing out unused files as well. It sounds like a very small ask, but it can also make an impact as well, especially as you scale. And then investing in unavoidable emissions as well, as Chris mentioned. I think every company is going to have unavoidable emissions. So if you can invest in permanent carbon removals, that's definitely the best way to go as well. I'm keen not to go into too much detail.
Yes, it's verging on that. Sammy, as we've said before, my goodness, you just need a whole day to talk about this stuff, don't you? Yes, some really, I mean, those are real practical tips that hundreds of not just Tech Nation, but hundreds of firms that you've dealt with at all stages in their life cycle are taking on board and actually taking action on now, as part of Tech Zero as well, right? So
yes,
and that stat about it's not surprising in a way, but twice the size of aviation. The fact that digital emissions accounts for 4% is shocking, but kind of not unimaginable. But the fact that it's twice aviation is an amazingly scary statistic, I think. So thank you very much for now, Sammy. Thank you for all of that. Swellen, coming to you. I mean, Sammy finished with a whole list of things that one should be looking at for your cloud service provider, which is quite handy, given that you're part of OVH. So obviously cloud services plays a massively important enabling role for virtually every type of startup and scale up, really, across almost all sectors. So why do you think then that it is so important for cloud providers like OVH to do more and also do better on what we might call your carbon impact offer to firms? And also, again, your views on, as Sammy and Chris knows, and as Sammy has said and Clara knows, there's already a massive to-do list, right? If you're growing a business, why should this be one of those things on that list that comes up a lot higher than it probably does on the priority list at the moment?
Yes, thank you, Shân. As a cloud provider, OVHCloud is enabler, but also partner for startups, scale-ups, and among others to reach their climate objectives. then for us, we are part of the problem, and we want to be part of the solution. And working on our environmental impact is one of the action we put as a priority for us. And you know, we are a European leader for cloud, but we are only representing 1% of the market share. If we compare to our competitor as AWS, they represent 30% of the market share. Then for us, market share is not the strategic objective. Differentiation is the objective. We want to be a trusted, sustainable cloud. And this differentiation was possible since the beginning of the company, because the company was founded. Now the company is listed, but still owned by the founders at 70%. And since the beginning, the founders built the company around two values: transparency and freedom. And those two values, 30 years later, have become a competitive advantage for sustainability. Why? Because wanting to be free and independent, the founder have decided to build their servers. It means that we have two factories that built the servers and ship them to our data centers. As we build our server, we are able to innovate on the server technology. And the big innovation of OVHCloud is the water cooling that enable to lower the heat deposition of the servers. And the big consequence is that we do not use air conditioning in our data centers. And the consequence is that we have less energy consumption costs, but also less energy consumption impact. Our data centers are very sustainable in that way. The other impact is also on the circular usage of our servers. As we assemble our servers, we can also disassemble them and reuse them in our process. We have a very high rate of reutilization. It means that we are really sustainable in the way we are using our servers and providing our services.
So you kind of, what I'm hearing is that you've built in, or it was built into the fabric of the business from the start, the notion of a circular economy. Yes. At least in your data, in your service, in your hardware, as you say, 30 years before it was really. Well, I mean, God, circular economy is only really being spoken about seriously in business for, what do you think, 2 years, maybe? I mean, generally in the business world, being something that you don't have to be a tree hugging yogurt eater, which, by the way, I am, with full transparency. So thank you so much. You've really explained that there's a purpose-driven approach that's shaped where your business is. There's presumably you're also now seeing the benefits in terms of energy management costs to OVH, right? I mean, they're allowing you, presumably that's another part of the business case from your point of view as a business, right?
Yes, as a business, having a low energy consumption is definitely a competitive advantage in terms of cost, but also in terms of sustainability. And those values also shape the way we are engaging into sustainability. We are not in the race of targets, because many operators have targets in terms of climate. They are looking for some labels. What we want is to keep the transparency with our ecosystem. We want to be a driving force into our ecosystem and to bring transparency into the way all our ecosystem is tackling the issue of climate change and sustainability in general. Then we are opening transparent dialogue with all our stakeholders. And this is illustrated by our carbon calculator. This summer, we will launch a carbon calculator that will help our customer to tailor their services and products in function of the carbon impact of the services. It will be completely free, and we will make it available for our customers.
So anyone that signed up with you is paying money for your services will get the carbon calculator. Well, hopefully when it's launched, Swellen, we'll get to be able to see this in action as well, even if we're not a customer of OVH, which clearly I am not. So just very briefly then, I mean, the number one reason why you think our founders and our founding teams and our investors and advisors who are tuning in should be putting this, you know, in the top 5 things they should be talking about now, the sustainability of their cloud provider. What's the one reason? What just pick, I know there are loads of reasons, but one reason that you think it really deserves to be up there on that list?
It's an easy way to lower the carbon impact. Having a sustainable cloud provider will lower your global carbon impact very easily. If there is only one reason, it is that one.
That one. Okay, thank you so much. I know it's hard. Again, all of you know so much, and I'm so interested. We could double the time, but I'm not allowed to do that. So this time last year, I was actually finishing off a very small webinar series for a financial services body that was looking at explaining and opening up practicalities of aspects of the E, the S, and the G for their members. And at that time, one of the major stumbling blocks that came back in terms of the questioning of those members, what are you going to do next? What's getting in the way of you taking action, was what was described as the kind of situation of the messy metrics. So there was a whole range of 3,000 indexes and more by now, I'm sure. There was too much, there was too little, it was too simplistic, it was too complicated. There was nothing that was completely right. My feeling is, my sense is, Swellen, that it's different now, it's better. So your top line, if you had to say, Sean, if you're an early stage firm and you're wanting to make a start, particularly on net zero and carbon impacts, this is a methodology, here's a metric, here's somewhere you can go to actually do something today, once you've finished listening to the webinar, obviously.
Yes, it's true that metrics and data collection is key to have reliable reporting of the sustainability indicators. I will leave maybe because data sustainability data can be used for reporting, and it is very important. I will leave this aspect to my to the co-panelists. I think they will have a lot of interesting things to say. As an operator, for me, data collection is also very useful for running a business, to make business decision. For example, if we are very pragmatic, the first issue we need to tackle is the climate change, then the CO2 emissions, because we are really running out of time to avoid the climate change, and we need to be practical and to be part of the solution as a business, and to make a sensible business decision. The easy way is to take the ton of CO2 emissions and to give it a price, to give it a value. When you have a value, you can integrate it to your profit equation, and then all your project, all your business decision will be driven, will take into account the climate impact of this decision. This is a very pragmatic, easy way to integrate the externality of climate into your business running and decisions.
Yeah, and getting it on the profit and loss, and getting it on the balance sheet, and also onto the valuation, I guess, as well, right? Oh, the valuation, sorry. Sammy, that, yes, it's a bit easier for you now as an early stage firm. You want to make a start on carbon impact. One thing, one methodology, one metric, one supplier. I know it's hard, I know that, but here's something that you'd recommend that people look at.
Yeah, it's really hard to recommend just one.
Yes,
I mean,
you can do 2 if you like, Sammy.
Or maybe 3. But yeah, I could be really quick. I mean, so in terms of methodology, the one being followed all the time is the greenhouse gas protocol. So that's the most accurate methodology to follow if you're measuring your emissions on your own. Depending if you have the resources. So if you're really early stage, you don't have any resources at all, I would recommend signing up to the SME Climate Hub, which by signing up, you're committing to net zero well before 2050. And you get free access to the normative carbon accounting tool. So that allows you to basically measure emissions yourself if you've got no money at all. I would also recommend you signing up to Tech Zero. We set up Tech Zero about 2 years ago for context. And we've supported about 350 companies on their net zero strategies to date. and we have a toolkit, lots of resources, lots of recommendations in terms of how you can calculate your emissions by yourself and also through carbon accounting companies as well. So if you have got resources, or if you're a hardware company, I'd recommend looking at the likes of the Sage Earth, which is quite an affordable carbon accounting company, Supercritical, or the likes of Watershed. There's lots of others as well. And finally, the most accredited kind of scientific body that you can align with if you're an SME is probably the called SBTi, which stands for the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So by signing up to them, you're basically aligning yourself to the science that your company aligns with 1.5 degrees. I think it costs about £750 as an SME to sign up. And if you are signing up, you would have probably been already expected to measure emissions. But I think aligning with SBTi is one of the most credible ways to be aligned with net zero as well.
God, that's super. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that we broke the slight rule and gave you time to talk about all of this. I mean, it's a great recipe. It's a fabulous recipe. Okay, Clara, same question to you.
Yes. So on my side, maybe one thing that I would like to point out, it's essential to standardize and to be comparable to the peers in your industry. It's not about having tons of metrics. It's about having the one that matters. And that's something that's actually taken more and more into account is materiality. So it's important for you to assess in your industry, what is material to my stakeholder? For example, if we take the cloud space, so obviously the carbon emissions, because data and it's data intensive, etc. But for example, there is a huge issue of diversity in tech, so that could be an important metrics. And as well, the data privacy could be something that is really material to the stakeholders. And that's where you can differentiate and manage at the early stage level. And to give an example of metrics resource that is becoming more and more used in the early stage level, I would recommend the principal in adverse impact metrics that are in the SFDR, and that would make the life easier for your investors. And that's something that would help afterwards to raise. So I would recommend that list of metrics and take the ones that are material for your industry.
That's super, Clara. Thank you. Just on that bit of the SFDR, it's a portion of the SFDR. Would you mind just saying that again for me? The particular bit that you think will really help in your engagement with your investors who are having to report on this according to the EU legislation that you mentioned anyway this year. What was that called again?
Yes, so I was mentioning the SFDR, which is articles that funds have to report on, depending if they are Article 6, 8, or 9. So 8 would be just ESG driven, and 9 impact driven in general, and 6 is just no specific requirement, not impact focused.
Okay.
And so the SFDR created the principal adverse impact metrics, so PAI. And those ones are definitely really easy list to follow and very useful because they're clear and easy to compare between startups. So then it's easy for us to tell which one is doing better, to show that you're outperforming your peers. And of course, only comparable on an industry basis. Because again, I wouldn't compare an hardware startup to a software one because it's very different type of
very different. Yeah, super. Thank you so much, Clara. Chris, what's the metric perhaps that's what, or the methodology that worked really well for you, and maybe one that you're thinking, oh God, I wish we'd done that a bit sooner, listening to your fellow panelists, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as my fellow panelists, I'll try not to repeat what they've said. There's a lot of great stuff. I mean, one thing that we wish we'd done sooner is I think something that Sammy mentioned is normative. It's a great tool and really helps you look at your emissions. I think, for us internally, where our focus has been, going back to what Clara said, is, being able to compare yourself to your peers, being able to compare yourself to what your industry, whatever industry you're in, what the rest of your competition and your peers are doing is really, really important. Looking at sustainability as a whole, there's the 3 pillars. There's the environmental protection, the economic viability, and the social equity. Environmental protection we talked about in great depth, and scope 3, as I mentioned, and as Sammy mentioned, is a little bit harder. to look at. So using tools like normative is great, and something we're starting to do. Obviously, the economic viability, it's a little bit more obvious. It's more about your profits. One that we focus on quite a lot is social equity. So what are we doing to look after our customers, our staff, and then looking at our global and local impacts? One thing we've been able to do by reducing our internal overheads is that we managed to give like 25% of our commission revenue to a charity of the customer's choosing. A lot of that going to like Rainforest Trust and some other charities. So that really helps sort of our sustainability as well. And then around, you know, sort of also on that, we also, you know, do a lot of work to reducing the poverty premium across the UK. So that's, you know, the premium you pay for financial services if you are in a worse maybe financial situation, which is a well-known phenomenon, unfortunately. And then very lastly, one thing we do, we measure, obviously everyone talks about D&I and measuring diversity and inclusion. What we find is that, you know, by having inclusive policies internally, that drives diversity. So making sure that, you know, people can work from home, that if you need time off to drive your kids to school, whatever, you know, that's fine, because that really helps that diversity aspect of it, which is obviously also a really important aspect of sustainability.
Super, Chris. Thank you.
Sorry, that was
so
way
much.
too much.
No, it wasn't. It was fantastic. I just don't think we can write fast enough. You're going to have to write something, Chris, I'm afraid, at some point. That's fantastic. And look, what a great group. And I absolutely know, and I'm sure the people listening in know that we could go on talking for quite some time, but we're actually really running out of time now. So I just want to end then with probably the most difficult question of all, and it's a hideous one, but I think it's an important one, which is your personal predictions for how early stage and founding teams will be seeing and feeling the impacts of the issues that we've been talking about today, including regulatory, investor, customer sentiment, and all the rest of it, on really precisely on their ability to grow and hit their targets over the next 12 months or so. Maybe 6 months if you feel the timeline needs to be a bit tighter. So Sammy, personal prediction, please.
Okay, I think this year will be probably the first time SMEs will have to take accountability of their emissions to continue their relationship with their clients and customers. I think, especially for B2B companies, if you've got even one large customer, with regulations coming up this year, they're going to be reaching out to their suppliers. So I think this year is the first time where that's going to be taken seriously. So that would be my one prediction, is that, you know, for the first time, I think, you know, net zero will actually directly affect startups, as opposed to the, like, you know, last few years where it's very much been a nice to do and a nice to have, rather than a must to have.
Yep. Fabulous. Clara, what's yours?
Yes, definitely. As you mentioned, Sammy, SMEs will have to answer to the reporting and their emission. I would say that it's definitely a key years when it comes to regulation, because the EU, but not only the EU actually, so you mentioned before the UK, also the US are starting to standardize and to make it a requirement to report on ESG metrics and impact metrics. So I think it's going to be a tryout. It's not going to be perfect, and that's normal. We're all navigating a new space. What matters is that it's now relevant and it can be audited. And that's a huge change for the ESG space itself, because there was a lot of backlash of ESG not being that reliable and not being that relevant. And that's mostly because it wasn't audited and that there was no requirement. Now it's required and it can be comparable. And that's really a key differentiator. And we're going to see who are the true sustainable players in the market, and they will truly benefit from it in terms of investment, but also customers. I think that's something stakeholders are more and more sensitive to, and they need transparent reporting in that sense to trust the brand and stay a loyal customer. And
okay,
yeah,
thank you so much. Chris, your personal prediction.
Yeah, obviously lots of focus on the legal requirements here, but I think ultimately, if you don't put sustainability as a company founder of a startup, if you are not putting sustainability at the heart of what you're doing, you won't succeed. I think it's such a key advantage for customers. Obviously, there's so much focus on it from a regulatory perspective now, but also from investors, and from key partners. Well,
Yeah.
certainly in our industry. So I think if you want to succeed, you need to be putting sustainability at the heart of the business.
Thank you, Chris. And Swellen, your personal prediction, please, to finish us off.
Yes, quickly, I totally agree with my fellow panelists that sustainability will help to maximize the performance. And to conclude, I will speak to the leader inside each of you. We know that we will need to refund the business and the leadership around the purpose and the humanity. Now the question is that we will need a big leadership, and not only business leaders, but also humanity leaders. And this will be
Wow.
my conclusion.
Gosh. Swellen, the hair on the back of my neck has just gone up with that. You need to write that down somewhere before you forget it. It's fabulous. Thank you so much. Well, that's it. And thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you joining us live today, but also on demand later. Hope to see you for webinar number 2, where we'll be looking at one of those really important material factors that Clara mentioned, which is digital data sovereignty and cloud. Again, especially for founding teams and their advisors, keen to ensure their tech strategy really does support future growth plans and targets. That's on 22nd of March, same time. And if you're watching on demand, I'm sure on a link very near you as you're watching now. So just before we close, here's a very brief message from our sponsor, Filippo Sanese, who runs OVH Startup Programme for the UK, Ireland and Northern Europe. Thank you so much. See you again.
Hello. Sorry. Thanks everyone for attending. It was a very, very great conversation. I really appreciated your time. It's a great topic. As I was saying, we are supporting startups in many forms and shapes. So please reach out to me if you want to know more about the startup program that we run in the UK and globally. And yeah, very enjoyed the conversation, and looking forward to seeing you all on the 22nd of March for the digital data sovereignty theme. And we will have again great panelists, and yeah, looking forward to that conversation as well. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Swellen and Chris, Clara, Sammy, and everyone for the conversation, and wishing you a great day. Thank you. Bye.